Okay, thank you everyone for being here and welcome to CFPR seminar series. So today we are very honored to have Professor Barbara Neves joining us from Monash University in Australia. So she is an award-winning sociologist of technology and aging. She specialized in loneliness and digital inequalities. Her research has influenced technology design and policy around the world. She had numerous prizes and has won a large research grant. She published in top-tier journals in social science as well as in computer science outlets. And she also often featured in global media. So today we are very honored to have her speak to us about the roles of technology in responding to loneliness in late adulthood. So without further ado, please let us give a round of applause to Barbara. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the very nice welcome. It is a pleasure to be here with you today, and I'm joining you from Melbourne, Australia. And so it's customary here to pay our respects to our First Nations people. So I want to pay my respects to First Nations of Australia and of the Kulin Nation, which is where I'm situated in the state of Victoria. And I am a big fan of the Centre for Family and Population Research. I think Mimi, would you mind just muting your microphone? I think I'm getting some sound from Mimi Tam. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. And so I'm a big fan, as I was saying, I'm a big fan of the Center for Family and Population Research. I've always been in awe of the research that you do there, and it's such a pleasure to be here with you today. And I've realized that there's people from different research centers as well. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Give me just 1 second, please. Okay. And I'll just put my slides. All right, can you see my slides? Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much. All right, so today I want to talk a little bit about a set of projects that I've done to really understand and respond to loneliness in later life in Australia and in Canada. So my perspective is very Western. And so a lot of the findings and a lot of the research has to be framed that way, which is a limitation of our work. We do work with a lot of different older people from different cultural backgrounds, what we in Australia call culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. And I'll mention some of those diversities as we go, but it is from a very Western perspective. So I'm looking really forward to hear from your perspective how this might apply or not at all to different contexts in Asia. So, okay, I want to start just by providing a little bit of context. Okay. So loneliness has become an emerging public issue, particularly in Western societies, and more we are talking about it, particularly during the pandemic. And it's interesting to see how different governments are approaching the issue of loneliness. And so in 2018, the UK government appointed the first World Minister for Loneliness, which was followed by Japan in 2021 because of the pandemic. So now we have two ministers for loneliness in the world that are focusing specifically on loneliness. But what do we know about loneliness? Loneliness is not a new issue or a phenomenon. It's something that was already happening. Sorry, my computer. It was already happening before the pandemic. And the data that I have to share with you is again from Australia and Canada, which is because it's where I've done my research. I am now located in Australia, but I've moved here from Canada. And what we know is that overall, between 16 to 20% of older people, so those age 65 and over, report feeling lonely. So not all older people experience loneliness. Loneliness is not a universal experience in later life. And in fact, we need to be very critical of expressions such as the pandemic of loneliness and the stereotypical association of older people with loneliness. However, what we also know is that when we look at prevalence of loneliness amongst particular groups, we see a very complex story. In fact, we know that the prevalence of loneliness in aged care facilities, so in care homes, in nursing homes, is higher than the prevalence in the community. And so, according to a lot of studies that we have from Western countries, between 35 to 61% of older people in aged care facilities, in nursing homes, experience loneliness. We also have another group that is likely to experience loneliness, which is a vulnerable group, which is older people living alone in the community while experiencing health issues. So these are top vulnerable groups. In terms of how do we define loneliness? What is loneliness? And loneliness is defined as a subjective negative experience of lacking companionship. And it occurs when our social needs are not being met, addressed by our social relationships. And recent research on the topic tends to focus on the individual and be quite psychological in nature. And of course, that is important. But however, we sociologists contend that loneliness is not only a personal, but also a social issue. There's also a lot of different terms that sometimes are used interchangeably when we talk about loneliness. Living alone, solitude, and social isolation. And these are all different terms. Feeling lonely is different from living alone, even though older people who live alone might experience a higher level of loneliness, but they are different things. Solitude is usually positive, alone time with oneself, and it's usually desired. And then social isolation is a much more objective construct that includes different variables, including levels of social support, levels of social participation, and type and quality of relationships. So I can have many family and friends and still feel lonely, or vice versa. And this is because loneliness is not about the quantity of social ties, of social relationships in our lives. It is about the quality of those relationships. When we look at loneliness over the life course, so across the lifespan, we see that across all the longitudinal and representative data from Western countries, we see that kind of W shape. And this is data from our Australian longitudinal study in Australia called HILDA. And this was prepared by my colleague, Rosanna Frick-Polly, who's an epidemiologist who also works on loneliness. And so we can see that W shape there. So loneliness tends to affect teenagers, so adolescents, young people, then goes a little bit up again in mid-age, and then grows considerably from age 67 and over. And so how do we understand loneliness from a different perspective, from our participants' perspective? And this is something that we really wanted to do in our studies. It's not for us not to impose our own definition of loneliness, but to ask them what it is to feel lonely. How do they define their loneliness? And their understanding of loneliness is very similar to ours. However, there's a lot of complexity that I really want to focus on today. But why are we concerned about loneliness? First of all, because of all the emotional despair, the deep emotional suffering that it entails. Our participants feel rejected, abandoned. They feel left to die, as you can see from these quotes here. It's the worst bloody thing in the world, Shudu told us. I cry myself to sleep. I'm here forgotten, just waiting to die, Chris. These are pseudonyms that were chosen by our participants. But in addition to that emotional despair, there's also really serious health and social risks. So loneliness increases the risk of, for example, depression, functional and cognitive decline, and diseases and illnesses that require long-term care, such as dementia. The latest data show an increased risk of dementia for lonely older people by 40%, 40%, regardless of gender, of ethnicity, of education, and even the genetic risks. But lonely older people also tend to be less civically and socially engaged, and so they miss out on the positive social and psychological effects and outcomes of social participation. And that's a very serious problem here as well. Now, as I was saying, I am a sociologist, and so I bring a very sociological lens to my understanding of loneliness and to loneliness studies. And this is really important to communicate with you today in this conversation today, because I really want you to understand my positioning as well. And so my approach to loneliness focuses on, first of all, overcoming understandings of loneliness as psychopathology. Loneliness for us sociologists is not a disease, and sociologists are, as I mentioned, very critical of the epidemic language because it not only pathologizes loneliness, as it has the potential to create more stigma, as we saw in our studies and as I will explore later on. The other thing is to rethink the deficit lens that is bestowed upon lonely people. Lonely people are negatively seen as in our society as or through a deficit lens, a deficit discourse that sees them as those lacking social skills, they are socially inadequate or inept. But research shows that actually lonely people have the same social skills as non-lonely people. And so this is something that we also need to consider. The other thing is focusing, of course, on the social and the personal, that relationship. It's understanding that loneliness is personal because it does affect the individual, but it is social because it relates to social relationships and to societal contexts. For example, our Western societies became more individualistic, and we tend to praise independence and self-sufficiency, and that affects how we perceive our role in society and our relationships. And so these are kind of three main epistemological points that really guide my research. So for this talk today, I'm combining all the studies I've done with older people and loneliness and technology, and I'll explain the technology part in a second. And so the studies that I'm bringing together today are studies that I've done with older people living in care homes, in nursing homes, or receiving in-home support from different cultural backgrounds, both in Canada and in Australia. And during the pandemic, I've also followed a group of older Victorians living alone from different cultural backgrounds. There were 35 participants in that study. It was a smaller study because it was done throughout lockdowns. So I followed them throughout lockdowns in Melbourne, Victoria, and we had some of the longest lockdowns in the world. Not both studies, but both groups are usually integrated in our studies that have a strong technological component, because our approach is to understand if technology can help address loneliness in later life, and also the potential harms. Can it help, and when can it not help or make it worse? So we have a very open relationship, or open perspective, I should say, to the potential role of technology. Now, all these studies were mixed method studies, and they usually are based on semi-structured interviews, qualitative interviews, diaries written by participants. So we ask them to write what they feel every day, surveys, which include scales that we use to measure loneliness and depression and social isolation. I can talk more about those if you want in the Q&A. And ethnography, which is field observation. So I actually spend a lot of time in nursing homes. And in one of the studies that I'm going to be talking about today, I spent 6 months in 2 nursing homes here in Victoria. And in a different study, I spent 2 to 3 months in nursing homes in Canada. And this is just to observe how people interact within the nursing home. And so from there, and as I mentioned, there's a big component on technology here, because I am a sociologist of aging and technology. And so across all these studies, we were also evaluating different technologies, from technologies that we created, we designed with our participant, that we co-designed and co-tested with our participant, to general existing digital technologies, including internet and social media. And this is important because new technologies are often seen as a solution to address loneliness, because they create opportunities for social connectedness, and that's meaningful social interaction. And so because social connectedness is instrumental to tackle loneliness, there's this big push to ensure that a lot of our interventions are based on technologies that are able to create opportunities for those social connectedness opportunities in a way. but we do require research to understand both the benefits and the potential harms and risks of technologies to tackle loneliness in later life. And that's what I want to talk about today as well. So I'm going to just mention one of our first studies, which was a Canadian study that was based on an app that we co-designed with participants. In this Canadian study, we co-designed this communication app for hard-to-reach groups, namely frail older people living in long-term care homes in Canada, which are a top vulnerable group. These participants were not only frail, but they struggled with standard digital technologies because they have, for example, Parkinson's disease, and so they have hand tremors, they can't type, or they have other accessibility issues, macular degeneration, or the other dexterity issues. And so we really wanted to create something that was accessible for our participants. And this study included a 3-stage deployment into care homes in Toronto, Ontario, in Canada. And each deployment stage brings in different methods. But across the study, we had interviews at different points in time in pre, mid, and post-deployment, surveys with usually with the scales that we were measuring. We also interviewed study partners, so family members of our participants. And we also had, of course, ethnography. So we were there observing how people interact with the device, but also with each other. And we also used what's known as usability and accessibility techniques, which are used in computer science, just to observe how people interact with a device to see if we can optimize that interaction. And then, of course, the apps had features that would allow us to log usage, to really analyze logs as well. I can talk a little bit more about the research part of it as well. So I just want to give you a quick overview of the app. So this was, as I said, an accessible communication app co-designed to communicate with loved ones. It runs on tablets, and it has a non-language specific interface. And this is because Canada has a very multicultural population, so we wanted to design icons instead of text, and supports asynchronous communication. So it's not direct communications like sending an email. And users are encouraged to think of it as a communicating digital picture frame. And this was because when we were doing all our pre-design work before designing this technology, and this project was led by Professor Becker, who is a very famous computer scientist in Canada. And so before we designed the tool, we did a lot of field work in nursing homes to understand what could we design that people could engage with in terms of communicating with others. And when we were visiting our participants' units, they would always come with the pictures of their family and the family albums. And so we use that metaphor to really kind of mimic that idea of the family album. And so you just have the app, you select the person that you want to communicate with, for example, Emily. I tap on Emily, and then I can send Emily 4 types of messages. There's that little hand waving. That's a preset message that we can customize. And then there we can send a photo, audio, or a video message. And that goes to Emily's email address. She does not have to use InTouch, and then she can reply back with also multimedia messages, and we can open and see those messages. No typing is required here because it was developed for older people with dexterity problems due to motor impairments, or, as I said, Parkinson's disease, for example. And so I have a short video just to give you a sense of what we've done. Let's see if this plays properly.
There's a lot of people who are getting older, people like my mom, who are not comfortable with technology. I've tried teaching my mother text messaging and email. It's never worked. But now there's something that's going to make a difference.
It's actually pretty simple. You don't have to have all those keyboards and things that the other computers have.
It's one screen with 4 big buttons. You can wave and say hello. You can send a picture, a voicemail.
Hi, John, it's Mom. How are you doing in England?
Or a video.
You know, I never thought I could use this thing he sent me. Wonderful. I'm talking to everybody on the phone.
All right, so this was just to give you a sense.
There's a lot of people.
Not again. Then I also want to talk today about our Australian studies. In our Australian studies, we focused on existing technologies, so we did not create new technologies, and we focused on robotic pets, robotic companions, social robots, and also virtual reality. But we also focused on general digital technologies such as internet and social media. And these studies also included interviews, diaries written by our participants, surveys, and ethnography field observations in 4 care homes here in Australia. And also we've done a study with, as I've mentioned, that first study that I've mentioned in Australia, which was done with older people living alone in the community throughout lockdowns here in Victoria. First of all, I want to tell you a little bit about how our participants across all these studies that I'm bringing together for this talk today, maybe that was very ambitious, but I just want to give you kind of an overview of all that we've been doing, so then I can talk about the challenges and the limitations of our work. And when we bring all that data together, it's important to see, first of all, how our participants define loneliness, how they understand loneliness, how they make sense of loneliness. And that provides the necessary context, I believe, to then explore the role of technology and its implications. And so across all our studies, for our participants, feeling lonely meant missing meaningful company, someone to share their daily thoughts, their feelings, their tasks. And so to give you a few examples from our studies, lonely is not having anybody. Nobody wants me, says Night Rider, and she lives in a care home. Again, these are pseudonyms chosen by our participants. There isn't anyone here to talk to, really talk to, gets lonely and so sad, told us June, who lives alone. And this definition, of course, matches our scientific understanding of loneliness as a negative feeling and experience related to an absence of meaningful ties and meaningful bonds. And this can be seen in these examples. But when we go into the experiences of loneliness, particularly in relation to how older people think about loneliness, we see much more complexity here. And that's why it's really valuable to bring in mixed data. And so when we think about what the data is telling us in terms of experiences of loneliness, there's something that's quite visible across all our studies and across the quant and the qualitative data, which is social stigma, particularly in terms of how social stigma of loneliness is internalized. Our participants don't want to be seen as dependent or a failure. They already feel stigmatized because they are old and some are quite frail. And so they don't need another layer of stigma. And for them, loneliness equals social failure, which relates to also our negative connotations in society. If you're lonely, means you're not good enough to have friends, in their own understandings of loneliness. And so recognizing that they feel lonely seems to be admitting to social failure and to lack of value. And that leads to a silent suffering of loneliness. 99% of our participants do not mention to their family, friends, or caregivers that they feel lonely. And this leads to that silent suffering, but it also leads to this internalization of blame and guilt. They blame themselves for feeling lonely, and they internalize guilt because they say, well, but at least I still have family, so why am I feeling so lonely? Or those who live alone in the community say, at least I'm not in a nursing home. So there's this constant negotiation in terms of how they feel in relation to loneliness. And so all these elements really add complexity to how we approach and define and try to then respond to loneliness in later life, showing how multifaceted loneliness is. In terms of, and I just want to give you a quick example. This is a diary entry written by June. So she was compiling diaries for us. And she wrote, and I really like to read this one because I think it's quite meaningful in terms of those experiences. I'd like to do Tai Chi, but I don't know of any over my way. Maybe I could meet new people. I tell everyone I love being on my own, but in fact, I hate it. I try to figure out what us older ladies could do. Maybe meet for coffee or a movie day. Most days I sit and brood or wish I wasn't here. It's okay. I'm okay. It's only thoughts. I also want to share this diary entry by Bob. He did an online diary, so that's why I don't have a picture of his diary. He wrote emails every day instead of writing a paper diary. And so he wrote in his diary, "Who wants anything to do with a lonely old pensioner regarded unproductive, invalid old man parasite on the community?" And so that stigma of loneliness often interplays with other social stigmas, including the stigma of being old in a Western society, such as ours, that is obsessed about being and looking young. And so this is really important for us to consider. In terms of coping, how do our participants cope with loneliness? They usually get themselves distracted from loneliness by doing individual activities, reading, watching TV, or by doing social activities, participating in the communities, in the activities that they have in their community or in the nursing home. But most of those activities seem to have short-term effects in terms of addressing their loneliness, because as they do not disclose that they are lonely, there's no kind of space and time to really process those negative feelings. A lot of them also rely on digital technology to address and respond to their loneliness. However, that use of technology.
And I basically told them a little bit of what Xiaoyang wants to do. That she just need a little bit more of
Sorry. Okay. Sorry, there was a little interruption there. I wasn't sure if it was a question or I'm going to keep on going. But what we found in particular in relation to technology is its ambivalence. And that is the ambivalence that I want to focus on today, which is when it works and when it doesn't. And we know that in science and social sciences, we have this positive bias of we only publish things that work or that are statistically significant. But I really want to make a case for how important it is to focus on the things that do not work as well, or that do not have a clear relationship, but they seem to be interact in different ways. And so if we focus on that first Canadian study that I've mentioned, which was based on their app that we developed, InTouch, what we saw from that study was that InTouch increased social interaction with relatives. So most participants felt that they were more part of what's happening in their families. And John said, "I don't feel so left out by using this tool because my family keeps telling me what's happening." But in terms of social connectedness, that meaningful social connection, we only saw it for participants who had relatives, family members living abroad or far in different provinces, in different states. And so even though overall InTouch was positive for our participants in terms of addressing their loneliness, and there were also positive unintended consequences, for example, really increased their levels of well-being, self-efficacy with technology, and so on, I really want to focus today also on the negatives. Those negatives that were were not a majority of negatives, but or that were pertaining to a minority of participants, but I think are still quite important to help us understand the failures that we can enact by doing our research as well. And the top failure was, of course, or the challenge was, of course, that InTouch made two of our participants more aware of their lack of connectedness and therefore more aware of their loneliness when family and friends did not reply to the message that they were sent via InTouch. And so one of our participants, and Chris was one of our Chinese Canadian participants, said at the end of the project, "I don't use it now." He was referring to InTouch. "I don't use it now. Why should I? I'm just here all alone waiting to die." And this had to do a lot with family tensions and norms and expectations regarding how technology is used across generations as well. This is something that I can also expand upon in the Q&A. The other negative element was it made participants more aware of their impairments, especially those who had, for example, aphasia and had a speech-related impairment. They would record an audio message and then they would say, "Oh my God, look how sick I am. I didn't realize my voice was so bad." And so it just made their understanding of their illnesses and themselves a little bit more negative. And then it also brought light to their institutionalization, because again, InTouch was only used with people in nursing homes. And so David, our Japanese Canadian participant, said, here everything is always the same. So I can't even take pictures and videos to send to my family because everything is the same. It's this little box where I live. There's no escape, nothing to show. So these are, again, really important aspects, and they really draw attention to our duty of care as researchers, but also the unintended consequences of all the research that we do. Now, focusing on other technologies, and I want to just mention the technologies that we looked at here in Australia. And these were not technologies that we co-created. These were technologies that were already created. We just wanted to test them. And we conducted a study with robotic companions in nursing homes, and then we conducted a study with virtual reality. And what we found across all the studies as well with different technologies is that there's similar aspects here, is that they have benefits. They can help in some contexts, but they can also make it worse in other contexts. But overall, what I think is a really critical finding is that with these technologies, from robotics to virtual reality, for them to be successful, they require substantive relational resources from staff, aged care staff, so nursing home staff, from residents and from users, to really compensate for issues such as infrastructure in the care home, implementation, constraints in terms of financial and time aspects. For example, in nursing homes, aged care staff are already completely overworked. So having to deal now with technology is another element that adds to their busy schedules. But also there's a lot of relational resources that are necessary to ensure that we have a care ecosystem that does not dehumanize residents by saying, oh, just play with the technology here. The other thing that I think is really important for me to emphasize is that technologies do not work in isolation, and they require strong networks, social networks, and logics of care to deliver what they promise to deliver. What about more standard technologies, such as information and communication technologies, computers, tablets, internet, social media? Again, we found a similar duality in our studies with older people, particularly with older people living alone in the community. For example, on the one hand, they can help address loneliness. And Colin, one of our participants, wrote in his diary, sadness and loneliness can be reduced if a person knows how to use a computer, tablet, mobile phone, etc. It empowers a person as you are in control of your private affairs and can communicate with others and action changes within your home. But on the other hand, we also saw that for some participants, when the contact afforded through technology was very superficial, 1 minute call, 1 minute video call, it provided an increased sense of disconnection and loneliness. And many also reported fears that technology would encourage loved ones to reduce visits and in-person contact, replacing offline contact with online contact, which we know as offline displacement. So there's a lot of this ambivalence that we need to address. So across all our studies, we always end the study by asking participants if technology can really help address loneliness. And this is what I was able to collect across all studies to show you today. Can technology really help? And so when we ask our participants, we find across all studies 3 similar themes, which are important lessons for both loneliness and technology scholars. First of all, personalize, which is what interventions usually don't do. We have the one size fits all. And as Gurney reminded us in a care home, we're not all the same, we're all different. And so we want different things. And as Anne in a care home as well mentioned to us, does it have to be only one thing, one technology? And so it's really important to personalize. And for that, we really need to understand people's social and personal contexts. The second lesson is create opportunities for meaningful interaction. Not just for interaction, but for meaningful one, spaces and moments for real conversations, for real intergenerational activities, for real participatory activities instead of passive things that they just have to attend. And this was something that we saw a lot in nursing homes. They have this plan, programs of activities, but then when you attend the activities, and I was able to attend the activities as I was doing my ethnography, that there's interaction between the person who's leading the activity, the moderator or the arts teacher or the musician, but there's not a lot of interaction between residents. And so those spaces where you can actually see some meaningful interaction happen are actually not providing that meaningful interaction. And then the third lesson was destigmatize loneliness. And Elsie told us, can we have a thing that makes it okay to talk about loneliness, you think? And this is something really important because, as I said, there's so much stigma associated with loneliness. And that stigma is something that we see from our participants that they tell us about and that we can see in our work with them, but also it's something that I was able to observe firsthand during my field work, which was every time in the nursing homes where I was doing my field work that a participant or a resident would mention to a staff member or to a family visitor that they were feeling lonely, the response was always to redirect the conversation towards a more positive direction. But it's a lovely day. Look outside. Oh, look at that beautiful garden. Oh, but you have so many friends in here. And so there was no really time, spatial, social, emotional environments to talk and process negative feelings of loneliness. And those attempts that I could see were brushed aside by staff, by family, by other residents. And that really reinforced the shame and the embarrassment of admitting to feeling and being lonely. And this, of course, relates to that compromised sense of personhood and identity and the guilt that some older people reported in our studies. So to conclude, I have just some key considerations to share with you because I want us to have enough time for conversations. Findings across these studies have really illuminated the need for a critical perspective that considers, first of all, the interplay of individual, social, and technological dimensions. So to both understand and respond to loneliness through successful tech-based interventions, particularly in sensitive settings such as nursing homes, we need to consider those social, what we like to say, the agentic and the structural, the social and the personal, those social material entanglements, because how we design, how we adopt, how we uptake technology rests on those factors and links. We also need to think about the unintended consequences of the things that we develop. And so by having a richer understanding of contexts, for example, of family contexts, we can help minimize some of those potential negative effects. We also need to reject the one size fits all, which is unfortunately what we see in a lot of interventions. And this is a criticism that I think can be also directed to ourselves as researchers. So first of all, we need to recognize the diverse needs and aspirations of older people. They're not all the same. They're not an homogeneous group. And this is also a failure that I think we researchers, myself included, engaged in, which is we study one technology and then a different study studies a different technology and then a different technology. We don't really have a proper comparative approach to study different technologies in similar contexts. And this is, of course, because of also our funding limitations. And I'm not saying that this is easy to overcome, but I think it requires some reflexivity from our part as researchers as well. It's also important to deconstruct homogeneous ideas of older people in care homes and even those living alone as passive or incompetent. They actually engage in a lot of work to cope with their loneliness, as I could see in the work that I've done and as I reported. And so we really need to have that in mind when we're designing interventions and research projects. And then finally, we also need to challenge this idea of techno-solutionism, or that technology is going to solve all our social problems. We know that a lot of these problems are not technological, they are social. But we need to understand, again, the social and the technical contexts and how technology does not operate in isolation, and how loneliness is has a complex social nature couched in stigma, in deficit discourses, and even oppressive social dynamics if we really want to have interventions that work in the long term and that we can scale up. And so finally, I think understanding the links between social and technical contexts will help us develop more than just simplistic technological fixes, approaches that can address the needs of frail older people living with loneliness, and approaches that really respect their agency and their dignity. And so one of the aspects that we have been focusing a lot on is, of course, co-design, involving participants in the design of the studies, but also of the interventions. Thank you so much. I've mentioned all the studies that I've mentioned, I have it in this last slide. I will share the slides with the organizers as well. It's been a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Barbara. Maybe if you can stop share screen, then we'll have you, great. So may I see if anyone have questions? You can raise your hand, and because we are quite small, so you can raise your hand and then ask, turn on your mic. Okay, sorry, Abhijit first, yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for the talk. I mean, a couple of things, but maybe the first thing first. Can you elaborate a little more on this stigmatization of loneliness? I mean, who stigmatizes it, right? I mean, is it peers? Is it family members? Is it sort of programs and policies in general? I mean, even aging researchers. I mean, are aging researchers stigmatizing loneliness by defining it as a deficit? I mean, so who's stigmatizing it, and how are they doing it? I guess to just kick things off. Thanks very much.
Thank you. That's such an important question. Thank you so much for that question. And it's a very complex one as well that I'll try to break down. So a lot of studies that are that we have on how society in general perceives loneliness show that it's always in a negative way. And so a lot of studies show that the societal perception in Western societies is negative. And so when we survey people about how they perceive lonely people, they always say they see them as those who lack social skills, those who have social issues, those who are unable to make friends, and those who are not proactive in terms of engaging with society. So that's the first level, the more macro level, societal level. Then you are right that because of course at that societal level, then it kind of trickles down. And then our participants then internalize a lot of that stigma, and they perpetuate that stigma as well. And so that's an issue. So they would say to us, I'm lonely, but it's my fault because I'm no longer interesting, or I just don't make an effort, or I'm just too old, I'm too sick, and so on. So they internalize, but they keep perpetuating that. And then, of course, aged care staff, so people working in the gerontology professionals, but also policy, tends to also put that deficit discourse on loneliness and on experiences of loneliness. And so it's a tricky equation to solve, because loneliness is a negative experience and it has really negative consequences. How do we destigmatize loneliness without really othering other people or making it a later life issue when it actually can affect also different age groups? And so that's finding that issue is really, or that kind of balance is really important. I just worked on a paper. It's a conceptual paper on the stigma of loneliness, and we have different dimensions, and the inaction comes from that macro level, but also the micro level. And this is something that we see again across all our studies and across the groups, those who live in nursing homes and those who live alone in the community. So that's the societal aspect. Then there's their internalization, so the more micro level, and then of course families and gerontology professionals do the same. And so it's interesting because it's the same, even though for us loneliness is not a disease, but it's seen as same as a mental health issue. There's a lot of taboo around even talking about depression in later life, right? And so it's the same with loneliness. In terms of those deficit discourses, it's something that we need to address. And there's a lot of campaigns in the UK, here in Australia and Canada, to destigmatize loneliness. The problem is that sometimes the language that we use, the epidemic of loneliness, my participants say, if loneliness is an epidemic, I don't want to have it, but I do have it because I feel it. So there's always the constant negotiation between how they perceive themselves and the identity, that the social identity that they kind of aspire to have. I don't know the differences if perhaps from your perspective in more collectivist societies, if this would be different, but in Western societies, because of that focus also on social, you have to be a social butterfly, you have to have many friends, it's your value is your network in a way. I think that probably adds another layer to that deficit. Thank you for that. It's a very complex question, but I hope I addressed a little bit. Thank you.
Thanks.
Jeremy?
Jeremy, yeah.
Hi, yes, I have a kind of related question also on stigma, but more towards the technology side. So you showed the video of In Touch, and the first thing that Lily said was, my mom is not good at technology, or she never, never, not confident with technology, or something like that. And to me, that was like, oh, ouch, like, so there's obviously some kind of perception there already. And then this idea of In Touch, developing an app that is ultra simplified. So does that also reflect, in a way, a perception that older adults don't know how to use technology, so we have to super simplify it for them? And I was actually reading your paper in applied gerontology. I think it's also about the same study, and I think it was mentioned somewhere that some of the participants, after using InTouch, they went on to use other forms of technology. I don't know, there wasn't much elaboration, but I was wondering whether, that indicates that some people actually have the ability to use technology. It's not that they can't, but do they need some kind of starting points of entry? I don't know. So this is just a bunch of thoughts, and maybe if you have any comments on that, I'll be really interested to know. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Those are such important comments and such important questions. And I didn't have time to elaborate during the presentation, but there's so many issues with that video. And I wanted to talk about that in the unintended consequences, and then I forgot. Indeed, so this tool was designed with participants with frailty. They have hand tremors, they live in nursing homes. Yet, we decided to do a video with a person who lived alone in the home, didn't have any visible physical or cognitive issues. So on the one hand, we were perpetuating that idea that a lot of older people, and we did change the script to say, the first script was older people, some older people don't use technology, and then we changed it to be some older people struggle with technology. However, you were right, they keep perpetuating that idea that a lot of older people can't use technology, which is not correct. Even though we did say some, that should have been emphasized more. That video brought us a lot of problems, and that's what I forgot to mention. But when we were doing the pre-deployment with our participants in nursing homes, we would show them the video so they could see how it worked. And a lot of them at the end of the study told me, Barbara, I think I'm not as good as that person in the video. She was much better with the technology. And I had to embarrassingly say, my apologies. The person in the video was not the user of the technology. It was one of our friends. So the person in the video was not the end user, the direct user of the technology. The technology was developed for people with dexterity issues, with accessibility issues. It was our fault that we didn't use. So when we were designing the video, again, it's all those questions that you have about, we didn't want to put someone who was too frail, because we also didn't want to stereotype people into that idea that older people are all frail, which they're not. But then we did the opposite. We put someone who had no cognitive or physical impairments. And of course, then our participants were comparing themselves to that person, which is not a real user of the technology. It was one of our friends who came to our lab for co-design with us. The other question that you asked, actually, I think is really important, is about, for a lot of participants, In Touch was kind of a gateway to other technologies. So at the end of the 3 months, they asked me, Barbara, can you teach me to Google? Can you teach me to do something else? And so for some participants, yes, but that was because they had the proper social support from their families throughout the study. So they felt quite empowered as well. Again, this is of course, nothing new for the Center for Family and Population Research, but family is so important in how we think about technology usage in later life and how we address loneliness. So those participants who were able to then try different and more advanced technologies also had the necessary family and social support to feel empowered to do so. Thank you so much, Jeremy. Those are really important comments and questions. Thank you for that.
So if I,
yes.
Sorry, I know Kriti have question, but my question is kind of linked to Jeremy, so maybe I ask it.
Yeah.
So I'm just thinking, like, because the technological tool is aimed for frail older persons be able to connect with their family and friends, right? So, I mean, I totally agree with having technology that personalize for their needs. But at the same time, I mean, should we also think about more like intergenerational tools that, if it's designed for older persons and, like one of the participants say like, no one's reply, right? So because young people, his nieces or nephews or grandchildren are using different platform, so it might be hard to connect. So
Definitely,
I'm
definitely.
curious what's your thoughts on this?
Yes, thank you. Such an important point as well. Thank you for that. And we wrote about this as well, how indeed. So on the one hand, our participants, when we were designing the tool, they wanted an app and they wanted to use a tablet. And we had a different idea of the hardware, and they said no, they want to use a tablet because that's what their grandchildren used. And so there was that kind of sense of the grandchildren are the digital generation, and we feel that by using a digital tool we'll be closer to them. But then what we saw during the study, and we published a lot about this, was those family tensions were about different expectations, intergenerational expectations about technology, right? And so, for example, when I interviewed the grandchildren at the end of the study, they would tell me, oh, Barbara, it just didn't work because I would send my grandfather or my grandmother a message, and then it would take them 3 or 4 days to reply. And then I would talk to our participants and they would say, but I'm replying like I have to think about it, like I'm writing a letter, it takes time, I need to think about the video or the image and so there's this huge disconnect between how they thought they should be using technology and how grandchildren were using technology. So even though to start with, the technology was designed because they wanted more intergenerational relationships. What we found is that, in fact, because we designed just for the older person, we missed all the other social ties that would be interacting with that technology. And so the co-design, and we wrote a little bit about this as well, and we wrote a paper on, it was part of a special issue on loneliness about when technologies are not enough, where we describe all our failures. But one of the failures was that we co-designed with older people, but we did not include their family and friends in the co-design. We just designed with the end user without thinking about all those social networks that are important. And so we wrote more recently a paper about a comprehensive co-design that thinks about all the social actors and the social agents that are important. It's not enough just to design for the older person, as you so rightly pointed out. It's important to have that intergenerational perspective from the beginning. And that means including grandchildren and children in the design of interventions as well, not just the older person. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Pretty sorry.
Hi, thank you so much for the interesting talk. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. So I'm a bit of novice at this, but I found your talk very informative. So I had this question, and perhaps it's already been answered in the field, but I'd like to learn more about how technology interacts with, say, people's personality characteristics, with their psychological well-being, because clearly, and as you also mentioned in your talk, that how technology impacts loneliness clearly varies. And so given that the older population is such a heterogeneous group, and of course, book has already raised some of those questions, about how people connect with other generations, but I'd like to learn a bit more about, for who does the technology work for? And for some people, perhaps it exacerbates their condition. So if you could just, inform us a bit about, what the findings in the literature are, what your thoughts about this are. It'll be very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really interesting questions as well. Thank you for that. So I am a sociologist, so I don't look at personality traits. I don't look at the big five or ocean. So we don't focus on personality so much. but we do have psychologists working with us as well. And to start with, we thought maybe extroverted people would do better than introverted people in terms of using tools. But what we found overall is that it's not so much about sometimes their personality in a way, but it's about the type of support that they have. So it's more about the social network that they have. And that's been our, now, having said that, we didn't really measure personality traits like the big five or ocean and those. So I can't tell you that maybe someone who is more conscientious if they use more the technology or not. What we can see in our data is that those who have social networks able to support them, to encourage them, do better regardless of individual characteristics in terms of gender, race and ethnicity, or even education. And so when I say the social network, I'm not just talking about family and friends. I'm also talking about community, caregivers, people who live, or other residents. And so that's what's been the most important issue for, or the most important finding for us. But that also means that for that, we also need to understand their individual contexts of families. And so some of them are in very small family circles, some are in bigger family circles. And so we really need to have an understanding of those social networks, which we didn't have to begin with. The other thing that is really important, and I think it just also addresses some of your questions, was that in terms of their openness to new technologies, it really depended on how we would present the technology. We did a lot of testing in terms of how do we introduce a new technology, and we know if there's a lot of pressure to begin with, then they already resist because they already think that I can't use this, I can't use virtual reality, and so on. So depends on a lot of how we researchers introduce the technology and how we integrate them as partners. So in a lot of the studies, we have to say, you are a research partner with us. You are also a researcher of your own experience. And so we really want your honest opinion about this technology, because otherwise they are doing a lot of impression management. They would tell me, oh, this technology is really good, when I could see them struggling with it physically. And I would say, but you're not really able to engage with it. But because they want to be nice to me, and again, they are lonely, and then there's a group of researchers comes to visit them for 3 months. It's just something that also adds to their experience. Now, for those who are extremely lonely and don't have family networks to rely on, having friends or other residents, creating peer-to-peer groups are really important. And that's something really that I think was something that we saw very clearly. A lot of them would say also that when we say personalized, it's also because we usually don't really understand their interests. There's a lot of interventions that match older people without focusing on their interests. For example, we found a group of older people in our studies that wanted to use a particular tool to do something very specific related to their interests. They were interested in researching their family lineage. And so they were working together on that. So finding what unites people in terms of interests instead of having something that is for all. We had other participants very interested in aviation and planes. So we had a group of them using technology to discover more about planes, even when we were testing virtual reality. So, in the lab, we have all these ideas of the environments that are going to work in aged care facilities. We had a mountain environment, a virtual reality environment. We had ocean. We had all these environments that we thought, oh, they're going to love this. And then the one that they really wanted to do was Google Earth, to go and see where they lived when they were little, so again, even though we try to engage them in the design of things, sometimes we just forget to get those individual narratives of their own interests to include into the study. And this is, of course, because of time and funding limitations, and we do those mistakes over and over again. But again, as you're saying, it's really important to have that understanding of the field before we deploy something. And this is something that has been a big challenge for us. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Let me see if there's any one last questions. Okay, So I think we already, we actually can end right on time. So, Apichat, you have more question? No, okay.
Now I just turned my video on to say bye.
Okay,
Thank
great. We really learn a lot. And so thanks so much for doing this important work. And thanks so much for spending time with us. And all the best with your upcoming field works. I know you're very, very busy.
That's
But thanks
good work.
for sharing your work. And hopefully we'll be able to see you again in Singapore in not too long.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for all your comments and questions. It's always a pleasure. And I hope I can visit Singapore and your center one day. Thank you so much.
That's great. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye.